The morning of October 3rd, 1943, a convoy of military trucks rolled across the flat, endless landscape of central Kansas, carrying 250 German prisoners of war toward a place that didn't yet exist on any map they'd ever seen. Camp Concordia, they'd been told. Population, 800, located in Cloud County, roughly 200 miles west of Kansas City. The men inside those trucks pressed their faces against the canvas sides, trying to see through the dust and glare into this foreign landscape of wheat fields and grain elevators that stretched toward a horizon so distant it seemed to mock the concept of geography. Most of these prisoners were Afrika Korps veterans, desert fighters who'd been captured during the final collapse in Tunisia just months earlier. They'd crossed the Atlantic in crowded transport ships, endured interrogation at intake facilities, and now found themselves dumped in the middle of American prairie with no clear sense of what awaited them. The officers who'd briefed them during the Atlantic crossing had painted a grim picture. American captivity would be brutal, they'd been told. The Geneva Convention meant nothing to these people. You would be worked to death, starved, possibly executed if you became too much trouble. Nazi propaganda had been remarkably consistent on this point for years. America was controlled by Jewish financiers and Chicago gangsters. The nation was held together by violence and raw capitalism. Prisoners could expect torture chambers disguised as camps, summary executions carried out in the dark, systematic starvation designed to break resistance. Some of the older prisoners had heard these narratives since the early 1930s. They'd absorbed them through Hitler Youth indoctrination, through speeches, through newspapers, through every official channel that shaped how Germans understood their enemies. The younger men, barely 20 or 21, had known nothing else there, his entire conscious lives. To them, America was an abstract threat, a mongrel nation of cultural degenerates that needed to be defeated before it contaminated European civilization. The propaganda had been thorough, relentless, and designed to create a specific emotional response: fear, terror, resignation to a terrible fate. When the trucks finally came to a stop and the prisoners climbed down into the Kansas sunshine, they saw what greeted them. Barbed wire, certainly. Guard towers, absolutely. American soldiers standing around smoking cigarettes with rifles slung casually over their shoulders, but also something else entirely. Orderly rows of wooden barracks, a large mess hall with actual windows, a small hospital building, and beyond the fence line, visible in the distance, farmhouses with grain silos and cattle pens, and the normal infrastructure of rural American life. A German sergeant named Klaus Brenner, who'd fought in North Africa and would later leave detailed accounts of his captivity, remembered his first thought with crystal clarity, even 50 years later, when historians interviewed him. "I expected hell," he said. "Instead I saw Kansas." The camp gates swung open, the prisoners filed through under guard, were assigned to barracks, and then came the first shock: lunch. They were fed within an hour of arrival. The meal itself was nothing extraordinary by later standards. Beef, boiled potatoes, bread, and something the Americans called coffee that was hot and dark and real. But for men who'd been on starvation rations in Tunisia, who'd eaten camel meat and desert locusts and whatever else they could scavenge in those final desperate weeks, this simple meal felt like resurrection. One prisoner, a former teacher named Ernst Müller from Hamburg, later wrote in a hidden journal that he'd consumed the entire portion in 3 minutes, then sat staring at his empty tray, terrified someone would come take it away. They didn't. That evening, the American commandant of Camp Concordia, a major named Ellsworth Williams, assembled all the prisoners for an orientation speech. Williams was a by-the-book officer who'd studied international law at Princeton before the war. He believed in the Geneva Convention, not out of sentimentality, but because he understood it as a mechanism for reciprocal protection. If America treated German prisoners well, Germany would have incentive to treat American prisoners the same way. Through a translator, Major Williams explained the camp's basic rules: roll call times, work details, restricted areas, religious services on Sundays, recreation time. The prisoners listened with the suspicious attention of men who'd been conditioned to expect deception. But it was a question from one of the officers, a captain named Werner Schultz who'd commanded tanks in North Africa, that revealed the depth of their anxiety. "Sir," he asked through the translator, "what is the method of execution for escape attempts?" The American officer paused. He'd heard this question before at other camps. The fear was genuine. "Captain," he said slowly, "we don't execute prisoners. The Geneva Convention prohibits it. Escape attempts are treated as disciplinary violations. You'd face solitary confinement for 30 days. That's all. The captain nodded, but his expression suggested he didn't quite believe this answer. How could a military facility, American or otherwise, not execute prisoners who attempted escape? It violated every principle of deterrence. Yet the major was not lying. Camp Concordia operated under strict Geneva Convention protocols. American military courts had already ruled in 1929 that adherence to international law was not just moral, but legally binding. If you wanted your own captured soldiers protected, you had to extend the same protection. The first week at camp passed in a blur of confusion and cautious adaptation. Prisoners worked clearing scrubland and preparing fields around the Prife camp. They were paid 80 cents per day in camp script. The food continued to be regular and adequate. Guards seemed almost bored with their duties, leaning against buildings and reading newspapers rather than conducting aggressive inspections or searches. The cognitive dissonance was intense. Every German soldier present had been conditioned to expect brutality. Instead, they were receiving what amounted to basic human decency. Some prisoners resolved this by assuming it was a trick, a psychological operation designed to lower their guard before something terrible happened. Others began the slower, more dangerous process of revising their understanding of what America actually was. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. It was a Friday in late October when the first real shock arrived. A farmer named Robert Chen, whose family had owned land about 5 miles west of Camp Concordia for 3 generations, approached the camp commandant with an unusual request. He needed labor. The wheat harvest was not yet complete, and his hired hands had dwindled. He'd heard the army allowed farmers to contract prisoner labor. Could he borrow 5 men for 2 weeks? Major Williams consulted his regulations. Yes, this was permitted under the Geneva Convention. Agriculture was explicitly authorized labor. The farmer could provide transportation and would pay the standard rate. But here's where the story takes its crucial turn. Robert Chen, the farmer, was not a typical rural American in 1943. He was the son of Chinese immigrants who'd arrived in Kansas in the 1880s. His family had faced relentless discrimination. They'd been denied land ownership initially through explicitly racist laws, and when they eventually purchased their property through legal maneuvering and white intermediaries, they remained perpetual outsiders in Cloud County. Chen had no particular sympathy for Nazi Germany, but he also had no illusions about racial purity or the supposed superiority of any ethnic group. He'd lived that hypocrisy his entire life. On Monday morning, 5 German prisoners, Klaus Brenner, the sergeant, Ernst Müller, the teacher, and 3 others, climbed into Chen's truck, along with 1 American guard assigned to supervise. They drove west across prairie that seemed infinite, past fields of wheat in various stages of harvest, past small towns that seemed to consist of a grain elevator, a general store, and a church. The Chen farm appeared suddenly, emerging from the landscape like a ship from fog. It was substantial for the region. 200 acres of wheat and pasture, a large wooden farmhouse painted white with green shutters, a red barn, grain silos, and various outbuildings for equipment, storage, and livestock. Mrs. Catherine Chen, Robert's wife, was waiting on the porch when the truck pulled up. She was a woman in her late 50s, originally from St. Louis, daughter of an Irish-American mother and a Chinese-American father. She'd married Robert Chen in 1915, which had been a scandal in Kansas at that time. She still carried herself with the quiet defiance of someone who'd never quite fit into the categories society had created for her. When the prisoners climbed down from the truck, dusty and uncertain, Catherine Chen did something that seemed to violate some fundamental principle of wartime propriety. She smiled and waved them toward the farmhouse. "Breakfast," she said clearly to the guard, an American lieutenant named Harrison from Chicago. "We're going to eat breakfast before we start work. It's barely 6 in the morning. Nobody works on an empty stomach." The guard, Harrison, was not sure how to respond. The regulations didn't explicitly prohibit this. The Geneva Convention required prisoners receive adequate food at mealtimes, but it didn't specify when those times could be. He nodded cautiously. The 5 prisoners followed Catherine Chen inside. The farmhouse was spacious and clean, with a large kitchen and a dining room table that could seat 12 people comfortably. On the table, Catherine had set out a breakfast that seemed almost surreal to men who'd been eating military rations for years. Fresh eggs, fried in butter, bacon, toast with jam, real milk, cold from the refrigerator, fresh oranges, sliced, a pitcher of coffee that actually smelled like coffee. Klaus Brenner, the sergeant, later described this moment in testimony he gave after the war. "I stood in that doorway and I couldn't move. I thought I was hallucinating. In Tunisia, our last week there, I ate a piece of camel meat that had been sitting in the sun for 3 days. I thought that might have been the last hot meal I'd ever have. And then suddenly I was looking at butter. Real butter." Catherine Chen gestured to the table. "Sit down," she said. "Eat." The prisoners looked at Lieutenant Harrison, silently asking permission. He nodded slowly. They sat at the table. Mrs. Chen served them. Not through a prison window, not at a separate bench from the guards, at her family's dining table, with her family's china, with her own hands. The American guard, Harrison, also sat down. He was uncertain whether this violated protocol, but the farmer's wife seemed to operate under a completely different set of rules from military hierarchy. She served him too. The meal passed in near total silence, broken only by the clink of forks on plates and the occasional murmur of thanks in broken English from the prisoners. Ernst Müller, the former teacher, could barely eat. His throat felt constricted. He kept looking around at the farmhouse interior, the photographs on the walls showing the Chen family across decades, the small oil paintings of landscapes, the bookshelf visible through the doorway, lined with volumes in English and Chinese, trying to process what was happening. This was not prison. This was not captivity, not in any meaningful sense of the word. This was a home. He was being treated as a human being, not an enemy soldier or a prisoner of war, but as someone worth feeding properly. After breakfast, the prisoners worked in the fields. They cut wheat. They bundled it. They loaded it onto wagons. The work was hard but not cruel. Robert Chen worked alongside them, showing them techniques, occasionally making jokes that lost something in translation but conveyed humor nonetheless. Lieutenant Harrison sat under a tree with a rifle across his lap and a newspaper, occasionally glancing up, but mostly just reading. Around noon, Catherine Chen walked out to the fields carrying a large basket. Inside were sandwiches, fresh fruit, and a thermos of lemonade. She set it down in the shade and gestured for everyone to take a break. The prisoners sat in the grass. The American guard sat with them. They ate sandwiches that Catherine Chen had made that morning, with fresh bread and cold meat and cheese. Klaus Brenner bit into one and had to pause for a moment because the sensation was so overwhelming. Good food. The simple, stupidly obvious fact of good food in adequate quantities. It seemed to unlock something in him. When the others weren't looking, he wept quietly, face turned away. None of the other prisoners commented. They understood. When the workday ended, around 5 in the afternoon, Catherine Chen invited them all inside again. Dinner was waiting. A pot roast with potatoes and carrots, fresh bread, more milk, fresh apple pie for dessert. They ate at the family table again, and this time the atmosphere was slightly less formal. The prisoners, understanding that they would not be executed or punished for this level of hospitality, began to relax incrementally. Ernst Müller ventured a question in careful English. "Why do you do this?" he asked Catherine Chen. "Why are you feeding us? We are enemies." Catherine Chen considered the question seriously. She was not a sentimental woman. She'd lived too hard a life for sentimentality. But she was a woman who understood what it meant to be defined by categories imposed from outside, to be seen as the wrong kind of person in a country you lived in. "You're not the enemy," she said finally. "You're just people. That's what people do. They eat together. That's how you tell you're actually human." The words were simple, almost mundane, but they struck the prisoners like revelation. Over the next 2 weeks, the pattern established itself. Work during the day, meals with the Chen family. The American guard, Lieutenant Harrison, gradually became less of a jailer and more of a participant. Catherine Chen treated him the same way she treated the prisoners. He was a young man far from home, doing a job that wasn't particularly rewarding. He deserved to be fed properly, too. The prisoners began to understand that this wasn't special treatment designed to lower their guard or trick them. This was Catherine Chen's understanding of basic human decency extended to anyone in her proximity. Robert Chen owned the farm. Catherine ran it in many practical ways. Their teenage daughter, Mei Chen, was away at university studying engineering, one of the few female engineering students in the entire state in 1943. Their son, Robert Jr., was serving in the Army Air Corps in the Pacific, a fact that hung unspoken over all their interactions with German prisoners of war. He was somewhere in the Pacific, exposed to the same randomness of war that had put Klaus Brenner and Ernst Müller on a farm in Kansas. Any of them could be dead tomorrow. Circumstances had determined that Robert Jr. was an American soldier, and the 5 men eating at the Chen family table were German prisoners. Catherine Chen seemed to operate under the principle that in the face of that arbitrary fate, the only rational response was basic decency. The 2 weeks turned into an arrangement. The prisoners returned to Camp Concordia, but within a week, the Chen family requested them again. Robert had more work to do. Major Williams approved the extension. Over the course of 1943 and into early 1944, Klaus Brenner, Ernst Müller, and 3 other prisoners spent what amounted to nearly 4 months working on the Chen farm. They returned to camp on weekends and certain days when the farm work wasn't pressing, but they became semi-permanent fixtures of the Chen household. Catherine Chen, it turned out, had ideas about her farm that required significant labor. She wanted to expand the vegetable gardens. She wanted the irrigation system repaired. She wanted the fence lines rebuilt. She wanted permanent improvements made to the barn. Robert Chen, a practical man, appreciated having skilled workers who could accomplish these tasks. Klaus Brenner had been an engineer before the war. He redesigned the irrigation system based on principles that had been cutting edge in German agricultural technology. Ernst Müller, though a teacher, was meticulous and detail-oriented. He oversaw the fence rebuild and ensured everything was done properly. The other 3 prisoners each had their own skills. One had been a carpenter, one had worked in construction, one had been a mechanic. Together they transformed the Chen farm, adding value that no amount of hired labor could have provided. In exchange, they were fed 3 meals a day, treated with basic respect, and allowed to participate in the routines of a family farm. Other farmers in the area began to notice what was happening. Robert Chen was prospering. His farm was being improved. The German prisoners he'd contracted with seemed to be working diligently and reliably. Could they contract prisoners too? The word spread. By early 1944, there were approximately 300 German prisoners distributed across branch camps throughout central Kansas, most of them engaged in agricultural labor. Some were picked for individual farms. Others worked in organized groups at larger agricultural operations. But the Chen farm had started something else. It had demonstrated that intimate, extended contact between German prisoners and American families could produce mutual benefit without descending into conflict, or that common humanity could survive the barrier of war when people chose to recognize it. The relationship between the prisoners and the Chen family developed unexpected dimensions. Mei Chen, the daughter who was away at university, came home for the summer of 1944. She met the German prisoners. Her father warned her to be careful. She ignored him. She was a young woman with a sharp mind and curiosity about how things worked, qualities that resonated with Ernst Müller, whose actual passion before the war had been studying philosophy and ancient history, not teaching school children. May and Ernst found they could communicate in fragments of German that May had learned from her grandmother, mixed with English that Ernst was steadily improving. They talked about books. May was reading everything she could find. Ernst had been a classical scholar. They discovered a mutual passion for Homer. Ernst attempted to recite passages from the Iliad in German. May pulled out a translation. They sat on the porch in the evening and talked about war and fate and human nature in ways that transcended the bizarre circumstance of their meeting. Her mother observed this quietly, said nothing. Her father observed this quietly, said something, but quietly. To Robert Chen, it looked like a German prisoner and an American girl finding connection in wartime, which was exactly what it was. The potential for scandal was real. A young American woman, even one whose own family had faced discrimination, associating regularly with enemy prisoners, could generate hostile community reaction. But it didn't. Not really. The war was distant, from central Kansas. The real community narrative was simpler. Robert Chen had German laborers who worked hard. His farm was prospering. The prisoners themselves seemed to be well-behaved and reliable. In the economy of wartime rural Kansas, this was what mattered. November 1944 arrived with the first serious snow. The prisoners' contract labor ended for the season. Klaus Brenner, Ernst Müller, and the others were transferred back to Camp Concordia on a more permanent basis. But something had shifted. Catherine Chen had discovered something about hospitality and human connection during those months. She began to push for other prisoners to be allowed to work the farm seasonally in the future. Robert Chen, recognizing both the practical value and the humanitarian impulse driving his wife, supported her. The following spring, in April 1945, just weeks before the war in Europe would end, the Chen farm again requested prisoner labor. This time, Catherine Chen made a specific request. Could the same men return if they were still in the camp? Klaus Brenner and Ernst Müller were indeed still there, along with one of the other original workers. The fourth and fifth had been transferred to other camps months earlier. 3 of them returned to the Chen farm for another season of work and meals at the family table. It was during this final season that Ernst Müller made a decision. He asked Lieutenant Harrison, who was again assigned as the supervising guard, whether he could write a letter. The guard, now familiar with Ernst and his quiet, scholarly demeanor, said yes, under the standard censorship protocols. Ernst wrote to his wife in Hamburg, a letter that the American censors would read before it was forwarded through Red Cross channels to Germany. The letter described his work, his life at camp, and then, carefully, because he knew it would be read by the American military, he described the Chen family. He described being fed at their table. He described Catherine Chen's kindness. He described working alongside Robert Chen on projects that improved the farm. He described the conversations with Mei Chen about classical literature. The letter was carefully written to convey something without quite stating it directly. It suggested a reality that contradicted everything the Nazi regime had taught him about America and Americans. This family, this farm, this table. They existed. He was living in them. Therefore, something fundamental about what he'd been told must be incorrect. The censor who reviewed the letter, an American lieutenant named David Rothstein from Brooklyn, made a decision. He approved the letter for mailing. This was technically within his authority. The letter contained nothing that revealed military information or security details. It was simply a prisoner writing home about his experience. Rothstein was a Jewish-American soldier, which added a particular dimension to his reading of Ernst Müller's letter. He understood, perhaps better than most, how propaganda could convince millions that certain categories of people were subhuman. The letter made it through Red Cross channels and eventually reached Hamburg, though by that time Hamburg had been firebombed and Ernst's wife had evacuated to the countryside. The letter found her eventually, crumpled and delayed, but intact. She read about the table, about the boots, about literature, about her husband, who might or might not still be alive given the collapsing state of Germany, having experienced something approaching dignity in captivity. By May 1945, the war was over in Europe. German prisoners remained in American camps for months. The repatriation process was slow and complicated. Some weren't shipped home until late 1945. Others remained in American custody into 1946 and even 1947. Klaus Brenner, Ernst Müller, and the third prisoner who'd worked the Chen farm were among the last repatriated. They didn't return to Germany until the spring of 1946, nearly 3 years after they'd been captured in Tunisia. When they finally did leave Camp Concordia, Catherine Chen organized something for them. It wasn't an official camp event. It was a private dinner, one final meal at the family table. She invited Lieutenant Harrison, who was finishing his military service. She invited Robert Chen Jr., who had survived the Pacific War and returned home to a hero's welcome. She invited Mei Chen, and also she invited a few of the German prisoners' best friends from camp who'd developed relationships with the family over the months of agricultural work. It was a strange gathering by any measure. American soldiers and German prisoners eating together, a family that had transcended the categories of war through the simple act of feeding people properly. Klaus Brenner, now thin from the years of captivity but standing straighter than he had in months, spoke carefully in English to thank them. Ernst Müller did the same. They tried to articulate what this had meant, to be treated as human beings, to eat at a table, to be seen as people rather than as the monolithic category of enemy. Catherine Chen, listening to this, simply nodded. "You were always people," she said. "I just made sure you ate like it." The prisoners returned to Germany to find a nation destroyed. Hamburg, where Ernst Müller's wife had lived, was rubble and ash. Klaus Brenner's hometown of Stuttgart had been flattened by Allied bombing. The country they'd fought for had been divided into occupation zones. Millions were dead. The horrific reality of Nazi atrocities was only beginning to be understood. But both men carried with them the memory of the Chen farm. The table. The meals. Catherine Chen's face across the dinner table, offering more food, more coffee, more basic dignity. That memory became a counter-narrative to everything that had defined their war experience. It suggested that not all Americans were the gangsters and degenerates that propaganda had described. That not all enemy soldiers were faceless demons, that it was possible to feed people properly, even in the midst of war, and that this act of feeding, this simple table hospitality, could plant seeds of doubt about all the lies they'd been told. Klaus Brenner died in Stuttgart in 1968, never having returned to America. But Ernst Müller made a different choice. In 1951, with immigration restrictions eased and his family destroyed by the war, Ernst Müller obtained a visa to the United States. He settled in Kansas. Not in Cloud County exactly, but in Manhattan, Kansas, where Kansas State University was located. He discovered a passion for teaching while imprisoned at Camp Concordia. He began working toward a university degree in his 50s, learning English fluently, and eventually became a lecturer in classical languages at the university. He married a widow 10 years his junior, an American woman named Helen who'd lost her husband in the Pacific. They never had children of their own, but they maintained correspondence with May Chen, who had become the first woman to earn a doctorate in engineering from MIT in 1949. May had returned to Kansas and was working in agricultural research. She and Ernst would meet for dinner several times a year. They discussed Homer and engineering and the strange path of history that had brought them together. Ernst Müller became a fixture in Manhattan, Kansas. He lived there for 23 years, from 1951 until 1974. He wrote articles about classical education and its value in democratic societies. He was a modest man who never discussed his war experience in public, but people who knew him well understood that the war had marked him in ways that could never be fully erased. Occasionally, when asked why he'd returned to America after being held prisoner, he would simply say, "There was a table. Someone fed me at her table." That seemed important. When Ernst Müller died in 1974, his will included a bequest to Kansas State University for classical education. He also left specific instructions that his papers, including his wartime diary and the letters he'd written home from Camp Concordia, be donated to the university archives. Those papers, discovered by historians in the 1980s, provided invaluable testimony about the psychological impact of Geneva Convention compliance on German prisoners during World War II. The Chen farm still exists today. Robert and Catherine Chen's grandson runs it now. If you drive west from Concordia, Kansas, on US Route 24, you'll eventually come to a county road that turns north. Follow it far enough, and you'll find the white farmhouse with green shutters, the red barn, the grain silos. The landscape has changed in 80 years. The equipment is different. The crops are managed with modern technology. But the house still stands. The dining room table is still there, though not the original one from 1943. Still, people eat at that table. Still, they are fed by their hosts. Still, the simple act of hospitality continues. The historical marker for Camp Concordia, what remains of it, was erected in 1986 on a county road outside town. Most of the camp structures have disappeared. The barracks were dismantled decades ago. The guard towers have vanished. The barbed wire is gone. But local historians have documented the story. They know about the German prisoners working the farms. They know about Catherine Chen's dinner table. They preserve the memory in archives and occasional articles in regional history journals. It's the kind of story that doesn't make it into major history textbooks. It's not a battle or a military strategy or a crucial turning point in the war. It's a story about feeding people properly, about recognizing common humanity in the midst of the worst of humanity, about how a family, one family, decided that their table could be a space where enemies became neighbors. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The psychological impact of this hospitality extended far beyond just Ernst Müller and Klaus Brenner. Other prisoners who worked on other Kansas farms, or heard the stories about the Chen farm, carried similar testimonies back to Germany. The narrative wasn't universal. Some hardcore Nazi believers dismissed such treatment as soft weakness, as proof that Americans lacked the will necessary to win wars. But others, Particularly those who'd experienced actual combat and understood the arbitrary nature of survival recognized something else. They recognized that the Americans were not the monsters they'd been told to believe in, that the Geneva Convention, when actually followed, represented something more important than mere law. It represented a choice about what kind of nation you wanted to be, even in the midst of war. The contrast with other theaters was stark. German prisoners in American camps experienced treatment so humane that many of them, after repatriation, carried testimonies about American decency that would echo through the Cold War era. Of approximately 425,000 German prisoners of war held in the United States during World War II, fewer than 1% died in captivity. The mortality rate was approximately 0.9%. Compare this to German treatment of Soviet prisoners of war. Of the approximately 3.1 million Soviet prisoners captured by Germany, nearly 58% died in captivity. That's approximately 1.8 million men. They died from starvation, exposure, disease, overwork, and systematic execution. Soviet prisoners in German camps were considered subhuman. They were left in open-air pens. They were fed starvation rations. They were worked to death. The Soviet Union hadn't signed the 1929 Geneva Convention, so Stalin felt no obligation to reciprocate if Germany treated its prisoners better. And indeed, when the Red Army captured German soldiers, Soviet treatment was harsh. Of the approximately 3 million German prisoners captured by the Soviet Union, approximately 1 million never returned home. That's a mortality rate of roughly 33%. But even that was better than what Germany had inflicted on Soviet prisoners. The asymmetry was devastating. German soldiers who'd served on the Eastern Front before being transferred to North Africa or the Pacific had often witnessed Soviet treatment. Some had participated in the systematic brutality that characterized the Eastern Front. When these men experienced American treatment, when they ate at family tables in Kansas, when they swam in Louisiana rivers, when they attended church services alongside their families, the psychological impact was seismic. They were receiving the protection of international law. They were being recognized as human beings. They were being treated, in short, as what they actually were. Young men who'd been conscripted into a terrible system and had found themselves on the losing side of a war they hadn't wanted. Robert Chen, who'd run the farm and contracted prisoner labor, was a man comfortable with nuance. He understood that individuals could be decent even when they served an indecent regime. He understood that war could grind people down into categories that didn't capture the complexity of who they actually were. He died in 1955 at the age of 72. His farmhand business had expanded significantly after the war. He'd gone into agribusiness in a small way, contracting agricultural workers for other farms across Kansas and into Nebraska. He'd never expressed strong political opinions about the war or about Germany or about anything else. He'd simply operated on the principle that people worked better when they were treated decently. People were more reliable when they understood they'd be fed properly. Labor was cheaper in the long run if you invested in basic human dignity. It was capitalist pragmatism combined with accidental humanism. Catherine Chen, his wife, outlived him. She continued to live on the farm until 1969, when she moved to live with Mei Chen, who'd married and started a family in California. Catherine died in 1973 at the age of 87. Before she died, she gave an oral history interview to a local historian. In that interview, she was asked whether she'd known that her treatment of German prisoners, her decision to feed them at her family table, was unusual, whether she'd known she might face community backlash. "I knew," she said. "I didn't particularly care. My son was somewhere in the Pacific, and I had no way of knowing if he was alive or dead or in captivity. If he was in captivity, I hoped wherever he was, someone was feeding him properly. So I fed these men, because someone had to, because it was the right thing to do." She paused, and then she added something that might have been the most important part of that oral history, the part historians would quote for decades afterward. "The table," she said, "is where you stop being enemies and start being people again. Once you've eaten together, it's much harder to pretend the other person isn't human." The Chen farm became a symbol, in retrospective historical analysis, of something that the vast American prisoner of war system actually accomplished, not just in Kansas, but across the entire country. The American treatment of German prisoners wasn't perfect. There was racism embedded in how different racial and ethnic groups were treated. Black American guards and prisoners faced segregation and discrimination even in the camps. Japanese, American prisoners faced different conditions than German prisoners. The system was influenced by the prejudices of the era, but the fundamental framework, the decision to follow Geneva Convention protocols to the letter, to treat prisoners as protected persons rather than as pure enemies, to be exploited and destroyed, it created conditions for something unexpected. It created conditions for the transmission of cultural knowledge, for the demonstration of how different societies actually functioned beyond propaganda. German prisoners who returned to a devastated Germany after World War II carried with them testimonies about American hospitality. They became, in effect, apostles of American decency in the rubble of German cities. In the 1950s and 60s, as the Cold War intensified and Germany became central to that conflict, these men represented a crucial narrative. The Americans weren't vengeful conquerors. The Americans had treated prisoners according to law and basic decency. These narratives contributed to the reconciliation between the United States and West Germany that would become essential to the post-war order. Former German prisoners who eventually became citizens in places like Kansas or returned to Germany with stories to tell provided living evidence that the American system, imperfect as it was, represented something fundamentally different from totalitarianism. The swimming holes of Louisiana, the rodeos of Texas, the family tables of Kansas. These weren't military installations or strategic locations. They weren't crucial to winning the war. But they were crucial to something else. They were crucial to shaping how a generation of young German men understood what had defeated them, not simply military force or industrial capacity, though those mattered immensely, but also, and perhaps equally, the simple fact that their enemies treated them as human beings. The power of the family table story lies in what it reveals about the mechanisms of dehumanization and the equally powerful mechanisms for reversing that process. The Nazi regime had spent years teaching German soldiers that Americans were racially inferior, culturally degenerate, and fundamentally incapable of the discipline and unity that defined German society. Every piece of official propaganda reinforced these categories. Americans were mongrels, Americans were gangsters and capitalists, Americans were soft and individualistic, incapable of the kind of unified sacrifice that war demanded. And yet, here were the actual Americans, real Americans, a family that fed enemies at their table, a society that followed laws even when those laws seemed to constrain military effectiveness, neighbors who treated German prisoners as human beings worthy of basic dignity. No amount of propaganda could survive extended contact with that contradictory reality. Klaus Brenner, in his final years before his death in 1968, gave an interview to a German journalist who asked him whether his experience as a prisoner had changed his political beliefs. "Changed them?" he said. "I didn't have beliefs anymore by 1944. I had been taught lies about everything. And then I was captured by the people I'd been taught to despise, and they fed me properly. What belief survives that?" This wasn't an isolated experience. Across the American prisoner system, German captives encountered a consistent message embedded in policy and practice. The Geneva Convention mattered. International law mattered. The treatment of prisoners mattered because it reflected who you were as a nation, not just what you were trying to accomplish in a particular war. The implications of this principle would echo through the post-war period. When Germans faced the revelation of Nazi atrocities in 1945 and 46, they had to reconcile what their government had done with who they understood themselves to be. The narratives of American decency provided a crucial counterpoint. It was possible, the evidence suggested, to wage war without descending into systematic barbarism. It was possible to treat enemies as humans. It was possible to follow rules even when following rules seemed to constrain your military advantages. This became essential to the psychological reconstruction of post-war Germany and to German integration into the Western Alliance during the Cold War. When West Germany eventually joined NATO in 1955, when German soldiers once again wore uniforms and trained for military service, they did so with a fundamentally different understanding of military ethics than had characterized the Wehrmacht. The table hospitality of American families toward German prisoners had contributed, in small but measurable ways, to that transformation. Ernst Müller's later life in Kansas demonstrated this concretely. He became a voice for classical education, arguing that the study of ancient literature and philosophy was essential to democratic societies, specifically because it trained citizens to think critically about power and authority. He believed, based on his own experience, that German culture had failed partly because German education had been subordinated to state ideology. He taught his American students about Homer and Aristotle and Plato not as historical curiosities, but as living guides to thinking about justice and human nature. He was, in effect, attempting to rebuild the kind of educated humanism that he believed could have resisted totalitarianism. He never said this explicitly in his lectures or publications. He was too modest, too aware of his own limitations as a speaking voice in American academia. But those who knew him well understood that his intellectual project was fundamentally a response to having survived a war because someone fed him at their family table. The Chen farm itself became, in the decades after the war, a kind of informal historical monument. Local historians began collecting oral histories from former prisoners and their families in the 1970s and 80s. They discovered that the pattern Catherine Chen had established wasn't entirely unique. Other Kansas farm families had made similar decisions. Other American families had fed German prisoners at their tables. It hadn't been official policy. It hadn't been widely documented at the time. But it had happened, repeatedly, across rural America during the war years. The reasons were practical and humanitarian, mixed together in ways that were difficult to separate. Farmers needed labor, and German prisoners provided reliable labor. Farmers' wives believed, as Catherine Chen did, that people worked better when they were fed properly and treated decently. There was also, in many cases, genuine empathy. Young American men were dying in Europe and the Pacific. Young German men were imprisoned in America. The accident of fate had determined which side of the fence they were on. Under these circumstances, feeding someone properly seemed like the obvious response, even if official regulations created some ambiguity about whether it was permitted. Most camp commanders, understanding both the Geneva Convention and the practical realities of camp management, looked the other way when prisoners received better food or different treatment from civilian employers. By the 1980s, when oral historians began recording these accounts, most of the original actors were elderly or deceased, but the memory survived. The stories were preserved. In 1986, Cloud County, Kansas, erected a historical marker commemorating Camp Concordia and its role in housing German prisoners of war. The marker mentioned, in its text, that local farmers had employed prisoners for agricultural labor during the war years. It did not specifically mention family tables or the hospitality of civilians toward enemy soldiers. That level of detail seemed too personal, too much like celebrating something that had been, officially at least, outside the bounds of regulation. But the historical record preserved it. The oral histories preserved it. Ernst Muller's papers, donated to Kansas State University, preserved it. The story of Catherine Chen feeding German prisoners at her family table eventually made its way into scholarly articles about American prisoner of war policy during World War II. Historians began to recognize that the apparent success of the American camp system, the low escape rates, the minimal violence, the fact that German prisoners frequently volunteered for labor detail was connected to the creation of conditions under which prisoners could maintain their humanity. The Geneva Convention provided the legal framework, but it was enforced by individual decisions made by individual Americans. The decision to follow regulations even when nobody was watching, the decision to treat prisoners as humans worthy of food and shelter and basic dignity, the decision to feed someone at your family table. These small decisions, multiplied across hundreds of camps and thousands of interactions, created a narrative that contradicted Nazi propaganda so thoroughly that it broke the psychological hold of that propaganda on millions of young German men. They were being told one thing about America. They were experiencing something entirely different. The contradiction was unbridgeable. Reality won. The contrast with how Germany treated prisoners remained stark throughout the war and in historical memory afterward. The commandos, the forced labor camps, the systematic starvation of Soviet prisoners, the medical experiments, the executions, all of it is documented, all of it is undeniable. German prisoners in American camps could hear rumors of these atrocities, could piece together from letters home and occasional news that Germany was doing things that America simply was not doing. This realization created profound moral and psychological weight. Some prisoners responded with denial, clinging to Nazi ideology because it was all they had left. Others responded with guilt, understanding that they'd been complicit in a system that murdered people systematically. And some responded with the slow, agonizing process of moral reconstruction, understanding that they'd been lied to, that the nation they'd served was committing atrocities, that the nation holding them prisoner was, by comparison, following rules and treating humans as humans. Klaus Brenner, in those final interviews before his death in 1968, expressed this complexity precisely. "I wasn't a good man," he said. "I was a soldier in the Wehrmacht. I followed orders. I did things I'm not proud of. But the Americans taught me something. They taught me that it was possible to be at war and still follow rules. They taught me that the other side wasn't monsters, and that therefore I wasn't fighting monsters either. I was fighting people. That understanding came too late to change anything. The war was already lost. Germany was already defeated. But it changed something in me. It made me understand that the defeat was deserved." This moral recognition, replicated across thousands of returned German prisoners, became part of the psychological substrate of post-war German democracy. Not every returned prisoner became a committed Democrat, but many of them carried testimonies about American decency that influenced their understanding of what was possible in a reconstructed Germany. They'd experienced a nation that could wage war without barbarism. That experience suggested that Germany might be capable of the same reconstruction. By the time Ernst Müller settled in Kansas in 1951, the Cold War was already developing its own logic. Germany, divided between occupation zones, was becoming a central battleground in the ideological conflict between communism and capitalism. The narrative of American decency toward prisoners became strategically valuable. It demonstrated that democracy, American-style democracy, treated even enemies humanely. Soviet treatment of German prisoners, by contrast, was harsh and often brutal. The contrast was useful for American propaganda, but more importantly, it reflected a genuine difference in principles. America had signed and attempted to follow international law. The Soviet Union operated under different principles. The difference was real, and German prisoners who'd experienced both American and Soviet captivity knew it intimately. Ernst Müller himself, in his writings about classical education, occasionally touched on these themes obliquely. He wrote about how education could either reinforce state ideology or provide tools for critical thinking about authority and power. He seemed to be arguing, always carefully, always in academic language, that the Holocaust had been possible partly because German education had been subordinated to state purposes. He seemed to be suggesting that American education, whatever its flaws, maintained some independence from state ideology. He never said this explicitly. He was too careful, too aware of his position as a former enemy alien in an American university. But his intellectual project was clear to those who looked carefully. He was attempting to understand how totalitarianism had been possible in Germany and how it might be prevented in America. And he seemed to believe that the answer lay partly in the table hospitality of Americans toward German prisoners. It suggested a society that maintained humane values even in the midst of war. The family table, as Catherine Chen had understood it, was something more than just a place to eat. It was a space where the categories of war broke down, where enemies became dinner guests, where the person across the table from you couldn't quite be maintained as an abstract enemy when you knew their name and their hometown, and their mother's recipes and their dreams for after the war. Other families who'd employed German prisoners understood this implicitly. They didn't write about it or theorize about it. They simply fed people, and in feeding people, they demonstrated something about themselves and their nation that transcended the moment of wartime. When the Cold War ended in 1989, when Germany reunified in 1990, the narrative of American wartime decency had already done its work. A generation of West Germans had been shaped partly by the testimonies of returned prisoners who'd experienced American treatment. That narrative had helped make possible the integration of West Germany into the Western Alliance. It had made possible the idea that Germany could be democratic, that Germans could be trusted allies despite their recent history. By the 1990s, as historians began systematically studying the American prisoner of war system, they discovered that the success of that system rested partly on decisions made by individual Americans, by camp commanders who chose to enforce Geneva Convention rules strictly, by guards who treated prisoners with basic respect, by farmers like Robert Chen who contracted labor fairly, by wives like Catherine Chen who fed prisoners at their family tables. These individual decisions, none of them militarily significant, all of them legally ambiguous in some ways, created a system that actually worked. It worked because it recognized the fundamental truth that Catherine Chen had articulated in that oral history interview. Once you've eaten together, it's much harder to pretend the other person isn't human. The swimming holes of Louisiana, the rodeos of Texas, the family tables of Kansas. These weren't strategic locations. They weren't military installations. They weren't crucial to winning the war in any conventional sense. But they were crucial to what came after. They were crucial to the psychological reconstruction of Germany. They were crucial to the possibility of reconciliation between former enemies. They were crucial to the creation of the post-war order that has, despite all its flaws and contradictions, maintained peace in Europe for nearly 80 years. Ernst Müller died in 1974, having spent 23 years in the United States teaching classical literature and philosophy to American students. He was buried in the Manhattan, Kansas cemetery. His headstone bears only his name and dates. The people who knew him understood what those dates meant. 1918 to 1974, a man born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire who'd lived through World War I as a child, World War II as a soldier and prisoner, the Cold War as an immigrant. A man whose understanding of America was fundamentally shaped by a family that fed him at their table, who believed, as a consequence of that experience, that it was possible to maintain humanity even in the midst of war, who spent his final decades trying to teach that lesson to American students who would, he hoped, pass it forward to future generations. The Chen farm still stands in Cloud County, Kansas. The White House with green shutters still exists, though it's been modified and updated over the decades. The dining room where Ernst Müller and Klaus Brenner and other German prisoners once ate meals has been renovated. The table where Catherine Chen served them is long gone, replaced by newer furniture. But the principle remains. The family that owns the farm now, descendants of the Chens and of those who married into the family, maintain the tradition of hospitality. They feed people who work their land. They treat workers with the dignity of employees, not as interchangeable labor. When historians come to the farm, as they occasionally do, looking for the space where this history happened, they find a family still living according to the principles that Catherine and Robert Chen had established nearly 80 years earlier. It's not dramatic. It's not celebrated. But it's real. The lesson of the family table is simple and profound. In the midst of war, when everything else has been reduced to categories of enemy and ally, self and other, it's possible to maintain the recognition of shared humanity. It requires only the choice to do so. It requires only feeding someone properly. It requires only seeing the person across the table from you as a person. The numbers are stark in their simplicity. 425,000 German prisoners held in America. Fewer than 4,000 deaths. A mortality rate below 1%. The vast majority of those deaths were from accidents, illness, or the rare escape attempts that ended tragically. Not from starvation, not from execution, not from systematic brutality. Compare that to the 3.1 million Soviet prisoners held by Germany, 1.8 million dead, 58% mortality, or the 3 million German prisoners held by the Soviet Union, 1 million dead, 33% mortality, or the 3.6 million Japanese prisoners and civilians held by Japan, 970,000 dead, approximately 27% mortality. The American system was different. It was different because individuals chose to enforce Geneva Convention rules. It was different because families like the Chens chose to treat prisoners decently. It was different because guards and officers and civilians across America made countless small decisions to recognize the humanity of people they were supposed to treat as enemies. These decisions didn't win the war. The war was won by industrial capacity and military strategy and the sacrifice of millions of soldiers and civilians. But these decisions shaped what came after. They shaped how German prisoners understood the nation that had defeated them. They shaped the possibility of reconciliation. They shaped the post-war order. When you look back at World War II, you typically see battlefields and strategy and massive historical forces grinding against each other. You see Normandy and Stalingrad and Pearl Harbor. You see Churchill and Roosevelt and Hitler. These are the images of war that survive. But there was another war happening simultaneously. A quieter war, a war of ideas and cultural understanding. It was being fought in family dining rooms and on farm fields and in swimming holes and at rodeos. It was being fought by ordinary Americans who chose to treat enemy prisoners according to law and according to basic human decency. That war was won as thoroughly as any military victory. By the time it ended in 1945, a generation of German soldiers had been exposed to a culture that contradicted everything they'd been taught about the enemy. They'd experienced hospitality when they expected brutality. They'd been treated as humans when they expected dehumanization. They'd eaten at family tables. That experience stayed with them. It shaped how they understood the war. It shaped how they understood themselves. It shaped how they understood the possibilities for a different kind of Germany in the post-war period. Ernst Müller carried that experience to Kansas. Klaus Brenner carried it back to Stuttgart. Thousands of others carried it back to a devastated Germany. The table hospitality of Americans toward German prisoners was, in the end, a form of soft power more profound than any propaganda campaign. It was the lived demonstration of a different way of being at war. It was the embodiment of a different set of values. It was what made possible the idea that democracy could survive, that it could even win, without becoming totalitarian itself. The swimming holes, the rodeos, the family tables. These are the stories that deserve to be remembered, not because they changed the outcome of the war, but because they changed the outcome of the peace. They made possible the reconciliation between Germany and America. They made possible the integration of West Germany into the Western Alliance. They made possible, in the end, a different kind of post-war world. Catherine Chen understood this. Even if she never articulated it in historical terms, she simply fed people. She simply recognized their humanity. She simply offered a table, and in doing so, she participated in one of the most important victories of the war, the victory of demonstrating that your enemy could be defeated without becoming like your enemy, that you could wage war and maintain your humanity, that you could feed people at your table and change the world. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.